The museum is located in Delta, Utah, which is a very small town. It's only got 3,700 residents, although it's starting to grow. And it's a wonderful story about how the people decided to preserve the land and for posterity. A lot of them educators, historians, teachers, principals, and people that had parents that worked there also at Topaz and wanted to preserve the story for everybody in the United States so it wouldn't happen again. The incarceration site is actually about 15 miles outside of Delta, Utah. And so it's a little bit of a trek to get there. Very desolate. So the history is that there's a group called the Friends of Topaz that started at the time when they were working on opening up the museum so that they could do all of the narratives for a lot of the work that would be displayed at the museum. And so it was an outreach volunteer group. And when the Topaz Museum opened in 2017, they then were able to spend more time looking for stories of Topaz, the survivors, the descendants, so that these stories could be preserved and not forgotten. And they were really happy when approximately a pivotal point, they say, from that I've heard, is that when they were able to meet Ruth Sasaki, writer and editor in the Bay Area, who was able to work with them and bring her wealth of experience and expertise so that the collection of stories was created and continues to grow and becomes more widely seen, as we've heard today. And also, I'm going to give a shout out to the museum who's watching today. Also, we're glad to have you. Also, J-Sei, thank you for hosting us here today and Topaz Stories. So the Topaz Stories is a continuation of the outreach efforts of the Friends of Topaz Museum. Our hope is that you all will become ambassadors when you hear the stories and tell your friends about it, that many of you will then go to, it's a long ways, but it's worth it, let me tell you, to Delta, Utah to see the museum as well as to go to the incarceration site.
My name's Ruth Sasaki. Thank you so much for coming out today, despite all of the tsunami alerts and all those other things that we have to deal with here in the Bay Area. I want to thank you for joining us today. Some of you from as far away as Alaska. We've come to the final program in our Topaz Stories 2024 Speakers Series, in which we've shared stories about the children of Topaz, families who resettled outside of the West Coast after leaving camp, the sketches of Topaz daily life that were drawn by Ella Honderick, the experiences of J-Sei soldiers who had family behind barbed wire, and in our last program, stories of the kind individuals who stood by our community during our darkest days. In December of 1944, the US Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the federal government could not indefinitely detain a loyal US citizen of Japanese ancestry in a war relocation authority camp. That loyal citizen, of course, was Mitsuya Endo. Knowing this ruling was coming down, the War Department and the Roosevelt administration lifted the exclusion order one day before the decision in Ex parte Endo was announced. This paved the way for the closing of the camps. Topaz closed at the end of October 1945. The last WRA camp to close, I believe, was Tule Lake in March 1946. However, Crystal City in Texas, which was a detention camp for families run by the INS, did not close until the beginning of 1948. As soon as the West Coast opened to them, the Japanese Americans began returning home in early 1945. But many stayed until the bitter end, having no resources and nowhere to go. As I mentioned in a previous program, the story of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans did not end with the closing of the camps. When the J-Sei generation began talking about the World War II incarceration, The focus was mainly on the camp years, 1942 to 1945. But stories of the post-war resettlement have gradually begun to emerge. Today, we're honored to share 4 such stories. Harue Minamoto was 25 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked. After exclusion zones were defined, Harue's Oakland family moved to Del Rey, California, initially outside the restricted area, where a relative had an apple orchard that needed to be harvested. When the exclusion zone was then widened to include all of California, the family was imprisoned in Gila River, Arizona. Harue and her husband, Toshi, had stayed behind in Oakland to close his business, pack, and store the family belongings, and they were caught up in the forced removal to Tanfran, and later Topaz. Later, Toshi's family, the Minamotos, were able to join them in Topaz. In 2023, a 14-page memoir written by Harue came to me from her granddaughter, Melissa Minamoto. Harue's clear-eyed, unsparing voice leaped from the pages, giving me an image of a strong, determined woman who was not afraid to speak her mind. Melissa introduced me to her aunt, Gay Kaplan, Harue's daughter, and Gay and her brother John supplied me with photos and further information about the Minamoto family. Harue's memoir is now excerpted almost in full on our website in 5 parts, and an overview of it is included in our Topaz Stories web exhibit in the gallery. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Harue's daughter, Gay Kaplan, who was born in Topaz. She will read part 5 of Harue's memoir, The Aftermath.
Thank you, Ruth. My goodness, the Minamotos, Kaplans, and Moonies are all here, as well as you all. Thank you so much for joining us and hearing this story. Just as to put things in context, my mother was in Philadelphia, and as many of you know, the American Friends Service kindly came out and sponsored families out of camp. And so that's where she was when she returned to Oakland. My father, Tosh, of course, had been drafted, and he was in Germany with the occupation forces at the time. So H came back on a train from Philadelphia to Oakland, California, with a 3-year-old and John, a 1-year-old. And she says, upon our return to Oakland on May 12th, 1945, we were met at the 16th Street Depot by our dear compassionate friend who was an Oakland police officer, and we bathed and dined in his home. For a month, we stayed at a friend's house in West Oakland and walked daily to our home on 6th Street, cleaning the upper flat, which had been broken into, waiting for the tenants to move out of the lower flat. I'd given them 30 days notice to leave as they had not paid their rent, and to our indifferent lawyer for a year, and they in turn rented out rooms and the 4 garages that we had. They were abrasive, threatening, filthy, and moved out with many things that were previously stored upstairs. And she did emphasize the filthy part of the story. Our policeman friend helped us resettle at the 6th Street house with the purchase of a well-worn secondhand stove, and also patrolled the house at night as we lived in fear. Various violent acts were committed against returning evacuees. Homes were burned. We were taunted on the streets with Japs not wanted. Was the trend of the times. The eventual return of my father and younger brother, Mr. Hirai and Mitsuyoshi, Uncle Mitsuyoshi, gave me inner strength, but the wave of homeless, penniless people began. The hostels of the Japanese Methodist Church on 10th and West Streets and the Buddhist Church on 6th Street became filled. 4 male friends of my father begged for rooms, and of course he provided it. A widowed young mother, a total stranger to me, came to the door with 2 young children, begging us for food, beds, linens, and pots and pans. We gave them to her from our basement, rusty cots, dilapidated mattresses, lugged down the street to a ramshackle house which she was able to rent. One night, an older Issei woman, an acquaintance of ours, came pleading for shelter. She fell on her knees, groveling and crying, and it was a soul-wrenching episode. Naturally, she stayed. Finally, 2 other Issei couples came to stay as the hostels were closing, and we had a full house. Daily, I did the laundry by hand, went shopping for groceries and cooked, and played the subservient Japanese female role, not receiving a penny for rent, meals, or services rendered. Every day they gathered around the long oak table and played cards or lolled around the house. Then the bubble burst. They complained that they wanted better meals and wine or sake on the table. Wine? Sake? This was too much. And one day, in sheer exasperation, in the midst of their card game, I angrily struck out at all the cards, scattering it in their faces onto the floor, and demanded they go out and look for a job, any kind of a job. I could no longer feed them on the $25 allotment that Tosh was able to send to me, let alone buying wine or sake, which was a luxury. They all cringed at my angry words, and there was babble of excuses being made. There was a great sense of futility and fear in all of them, and it seemed it was up to me to help them regain their dignity, pride, and courage. The ensuing weeks were spent on the phone or walking to places looking, asking, and searching for jobs for them, no matter how menial. Eventually, they drifted away to another beginning, and the task of rebuilding our own lives began. Thank you.
I really recommend that you go to our website and read all 5 parts of Harue's memoir. It's really worth a read. Thank you, Gay. Our next speaker is Kazuko Iwahashi. Kaz was 12 to 15 years old in Topaz. Her family, the Oyamadas, lived on University Avenue in Berkeley before the war. In Yaya Kami Yadlowski's story, Friends Forever, which you can read on our website, she remembers how her parents and younger siblings had to move out of their house on the north side of University after so-called enemy aliens were forbidden to live north of University. They moved across the street to the south side of University, where Yaya's friend, Kaz Oyamada, lived. The Oyamadas opened their home to the Kamis, enabling them to remain near their older children, including Yaya, who were US citizens and had remained in the Kami family home. Eventually, they were all forcibly removed to Tanfran Assembly Center in San Bruno before being transferred to Topaz. I first met Kaz in 2003 on an unforgettable and very long bus ride to my first pilgrimage in Topaz. We later reconnected through our volunteer work as writing coaches for junior high school kids in El Cerrito. Kaz was one of the 4 friends, 4 women whose friendship, some started in Topaz, continued throughout the years. We received stories or memoirs from 3 of them, Yaya Kami, Grace Mori Saito Tam, and Setsuko Asano Ogami, but Kaz was the lone holdout. Kaz has been writing for a long time, and I've been trying to get her to give us a story for years. So I was ecstatic and very gratified when a year ago she agreed. Please welcome Kazuko Iwahashi reading Questions I Never Asked Mom.
Good afternoon. It's nice to see. I see some familiar faces out there too. I and I was there was a period of time, maybe about 20 years ago or so, when writing classes were coming up because they were saying that we have to tell our stories. So there was a couple in the East Bay, but since I was in the East Bay, that's where I joined. And so my original version of this was written actually November 8th of 2011. And I don't know how I chose this as a title, but I think, when we do have our writing class, we always have a discussion program. And I think that during that time, these things came up of why we didn't ask our parents certain things. So this is what I ended up with. When World War II broke out, Mom was a young 32-year-old with 4 young children. Dad was 43, a nurseryman and a gardener. I, their eldest child, was to become 12 in 5 days after December 7th, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Next in line was my sister Aki, 22 months younger than me. Seiji, my only brother, was 5 years old. The baby of the family was Michi, who would be 2 in 1942. Mom, what crossed your mind when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor? After all, your parents and 4 sisters were living in Japan. Since I never knew them, they didn't visit us, and we never traveled to Japan. Out of sight, out of mind, especially for a 12-year-old, or a 12-year-old to become 12. In our days, most of the children, we never knew our relatives in Japan. So nowadays it's lucky that our children know their grandparents, but I never did. You must have been worried about them, but you certainly didn't show it. Did you worry about us as much as your family in Japan? After all, you couldn't see them, and we were at your side. When government orders came that we, along with others of Japanese ancestry, would be forced to move to an unknown place, were you scared? Being a mother myself, if I was in your shoes, I would have been terrified. My baby was only your baby was only 2 years old, still in diapers and drinking out of a bottle. If I remember correctly, that was what it was like. I'm lucky. Sorry. I'm thinking she must have been weaned from the bottle rather quickly, for how could you carry baby bottles on such a journey? And how did you question how many diapers to take? With 4 children, how did you and Dad decide what to sell, store, give away, and what to take? Dad, I knew, helped in making the major decisions, but a mother is different when thinking of the basic needs of her children. What about the things dear to the child, to take or not to take? How could you know anything when your destination was unknown? And orders were to take only what you could carry. How was Michi a toddler to be to carry her things? And how much more could the 5-year Seiji carry? Somehow, between you and Dad, the family was ready to leave Berkeley on our appointed time, a date in May of 1942. How heartbreaking it must have been to leave the only home you knew and where you had raised your children. I'll never know. I never asked you, being too young, and I never asked you as an adult. Mom, how did we behave? Did you have much trouble with us? First, going on the bus to Chanfran Racetrack, our temporary home. What a tremendous transition it must have been. Thinking back, having friends from Berkeley close by alleviated some of the newness and unexpected living conditions. After 3 to 4 months adjusting to Tanforan life, was it any easier and different traveling on a 3-day train through Nevada to the state of Utah to our permanent home? Remember, I'm remembering what it was like to ride on the old, hot and stuffy, noisy, crowded train. I realized it must have been a real challenge for all moms like you. Topaz, our final destination, was in the middle of nowhere in the Utah desert. What did you think when you saw all those black tarred barracks amidst the hot air, the dry, white, loose soil? And then being greeted by the fine dust flying around. How did you and Dad manage to get us all to our block and barrack? What did you see and what did you do when you went into the one-room apartment, which was to be our home for an indefinite length of time? I won't even try to imagine because I was not old enough to realize the dreadful immediate days to come. Mom, you took care of our basic needs, washing our clothes in the laundry room, using a scrub board and the hard soap, bathing the younger kids. Oh, the diapers must have been a chore, but a job that needed to be done. I know at some point you worked as a waitress in our mess hall, but who took care of Michi when you were working? I was in my own world with my friends and wasn't aware of my little sister. You must have made some arrangements with someone to keep an eye on her. I'm afraid I wasn't much of a big sister to Michi or helpful to you. If you complained, I never heard you. When Dad left Topaz in early 1945 to find a job and a home, he found gardening work with his pre-war customers, but he didn't find a home for us, or a house even, because you and Dad wanted me to start school at Berkeley High. I left you behind in camp with my younger siblings, traveling by myself. Dad found me a job as a schoolgirl so I could have a place to stay, working for my room and board and receiving a small salary while going to high school. In October of 1945, Topaz closed and you had to leave. Years later, you told me that you didn't know you had to leave because you had no one to tell you what was happening or what to do. You didn't say how you managed to end up at Hunters Point Government Housing Project in San Francisco with the 3 young children in tow. I didn't know that you were there because you had no place to go. Dad finally found a house in Berkeley and in time purchased it. How was it having a home of your own again? There he raised Aki, Seiji, Michi until they grew up, married, and moved out. It was a lovely, warm, bright house and home. Dad tended to a beautiful garden. Your children and grandchildren have many wonderful memories of that 1628 Blake Street. Thank you. In the years that I've been writing, trying to recall my life growing up, I do have regrets that there was a long period of time when parents were not talking about the war years, nor were we, the children, asking questions. So the questions are going unanswered. I can only hope to fill in the gaps by talking to others who may have had similar experiences. I also feel that Mom and Dad survived the best they could by their faith in themselves, the trust in and of their friends, but primarily because of their Japanese upbringing and culture. I am also blessed by people who knew them and when they tell me how they touched their lives. The questions I never asked Mom remain, but the memories I do have to remind me of my past. Thank you.
This is Michi's story, and this is of a Topaz childhood. Michi writes, "The sandstorms were so bad, I had to wear my bandana out to cover all my face and tie it behind my back of my head. The sand came in our room, especially by the windowsills, an inch thick. When the snow turned to ice, I used to slip when walking to school, since the treads on my snow boots had worn out. Ordering new snow boots from a catalog was possible, but not a priority for my parents when there were 8 of us children. All of our clothes and shoes were ordered from the Montgomery Ward catalog. When we ordered shoes, my mother would trace my feet on a piece of paper and enclose it together with the order, since she wasn't sure what size I wore. When I got my shoes, they were too narrow, and they hurt my toes so badly, I threw a temper tantrum. When my father scolded me and told me I had to wear them regardless. So eventually, I developed a corn on my little left toe. And years later, as an adult, it still bothered me. I finally had minor toe surgery to remove a segment of bone in my little left toe. My parents were Manzo and Hatsumi Takeshita, and I was born in 1935, the 8th of 9 children. My one older brother had died before the war at the age of 2. My 2 eldest brothers were Satoshi Spencer and Yuzu John, were Kibes, partly educated in Japan before returning to California in 1940. Before the war, we lived in San Mateo, where my father had a landscaping and gardening business. But in Topaz, my father got a job as a carpenter to help build a high school, so he was able to drive a truck home. He would give my little brother and me a ride in the front seat. Our block was number 37 at the end of the perimeter of the camp, so he would drive us back and forth next to the barbed wire fence. That was such a treat. But we were only in Topaz for about a year. My older brothers, Satoshi and Yuzu, answered no to the loyalty questionnaire, questions 27 and 28, for all those that were over 18 had to fill out. Years later, Yuzu explained, "We were American citizens by birth, but deprived of our constitutional rights when we were singled out to be put away behind barbed wire. Our only guilt was the accident of having been born Japanese." I didn't understand at the time why we had to go to Tule Lake, but later I learned that my parents also answered no to keep the family together. In Tule Lake, we thought we would be deported to Japan, so we started attending Japanese school. We couldn't speak a word of English amongst friends or family. If we did, classmates were allowed to pinch us. It was like a game. I learned Japanese language, math, and cultural things. And to this day, the multiplication table comes to mind in Japanese rather than English. When the war ended, some families took the first boat to Japan, including Satoshi Spencer, my oldest brother. He later explained that because he was bilingual, he thought he could help Japan recover from the war. But when he got there, he immediately telegraphed us, "Don't come back. People in Japan were starving. There's no food, no shelter." So we returned to San Mateo. Fortunately, my uncle, my mother's younger brother, and family had owned their own home before the war, and he graciously shared his home with us. My father, resumed his landscaping business, picking up customers here and there. My older sisters worked as schoolgirls or as live-in nannies while going to high school. Brother Ben worked for a family too. He was cleaning out the pigeon coops. Roy delivered papers on his bike. By this time, I was 10, but I had to go back to the 3rd grade instead of the 5th grade because I had forgotten all my English. I was so embarrassed, especially because I had to go back to the same school I attended before the war. Before camp, I had a good friend, Louise, and she even wrote me a note when I was at the Tanforan Assembly Center. But now I couldn't even make eye contact with her. I was a different person. Feeling ashamed, it was difficult assimilating back to civilization. My older siblings said, "Don't tell anyone, even amongst the Japanese community, that we were in Tule Lake, since we were branded as disloyal." Plus, hearing people say, "Japs live here," in a mixed community, I think back and wonder, how did I survive that double whammy of discrimination? However, within a few months, my English came back and I got new friends. But the stigma of being 2 years older than my classmates stuck with me all throughout high school. I attended summer school and I told my counselor that I wanted to graduate as soon as possible. I was 19 years old when I graduated from San Mateo High School in 1955. My father died in 1953, so college was not in the picture. I was so envious of my friends who did go to college. Brother John was in college. Ben and Roy served in the Korean War and went on to college with the GI Bill. Even my younger brother Yosh quitted community college to join the Air Force. My older sisters had gotten married by then to someone, so someone had to stay at home with our mother and bring home the bacon. Some of my older siblings did chip in to help out with my meager salary from the Pacific Telephone and Telegraph, where I worked in the stenographer's pool. But working in San Francisco was the best thing for me. I finally blossomed and got out of my shell. I worked my way up to be a secretary to a college recruiter in the personnel department and worked there for 8 years before I got married. In hindsight, I'm glad that the evacuation happened when I was young, because children are resilient. And as long as I had my family with me and around me, I felt relatively secure. But for my parents, given only a few months to get rid of all of our belongings, except for what each could carry, and my older brothers and sisters, some in high school about ready to graduate, where normally you would look forward to making plans for a job or college. Their futures were uncertain. How difficult it must have been for them. Yes, my whole camp experience had a major impact on my life, a mixture of both good and bad. Now I'm 86 years old. As I age, there will be inevitable changes, but I shall now face those challenges with a grateful heart and a settled mind.
For those of you who are doing mental math, she said she's 86 years old at the end, but she was born in 1935, and that's because she wrote the story a couple of years ago. In 2019, Jonathan Hirabayashi, our exhibit designer, introduced me by email to his cousin, Meri Mitsuyoshi. Meri's family had a painting done by Meri's grandfather, Saburo Tamura, in Topaz. He thought the backstory to this painting might make a good addition to our collection. Over a few months of exchanged emails, the story of Saburo Tamura's painting emerged, just in time to be included in our exhibit at the Utah State Capitol, which was originally supposed to open in June of 2020, meaning that the stories had to be selected by March 2020. It struck me as the perfect story to close the exhibit with, as it is essentially a story from the viewpoint of my generation, a Sansei, or third generation, post-war descendant. Please welcome Meri Mitsuyoshi, reading Untitled by Saburo Tamura.
Thank you, everyone. I'm happy that today my mother is in attendance. Terry Mitsuyoshi was a member of the Topaz High School class of 1945 and celebrated her 97th birthday 2 weeks ago today. And much of this story is also her story. Over 3 decades ago, I made my first pilgrimage to Topaz, where my grandparents and their families were incarcerated during World War II. There was little evidence of what the War Relocation Authority built there 40+ years before, but standing amid the barrack foundation fragments, I was stunned by a sense of recognition. In the distance rose the outline of a mountain that was present throughout my childhood. In my grandparents' home in California hung a landscape painting. An expansive desert led up to a number of identical rectangular buildings, and behind them was the focus of the work, a mountain looming over the relatively tiny structures. In keeping with reticent Nikkei tradition, words about the painting, as well as the majority of the World War II experience, were left unspoken. My grandfather, Saburo Tamura, was a chrysanthemum grower in Redwood City before the war. After establishing a nursery, he returned to Japan to marry my grandmother, Isoya Ichihara. They then crossed the Pacific together to begin their shared life on the San Francisco Peninsula. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, the FBI arrested my grandfather at home. My mother, who was 14, vividly remembers seeing an agent opening their freezer, pulling out an ice cube tray, and submerging it in water, presumably to search for incriminating evidence. She also recalls that another agent seemed troubled by the sight of a young mother and her 3 daughters witnessing their father being handcuffed and led away. For months, my grandmother was not informed why or where my grandfather was taken, but she eventually learned that he had been sent to Fort Lincoln, near Bismarck, North Dakota. My grandparents corresponded prior to the evacuation and continued to do so until the family was reunited in Topaz. My aunt still has these letters, which reflect the influence of my grandfather's efforts to learn his second language. After immigrating, he exchanged janitorial services for English studies with an instructor at Stanford University. I imagine that his written formality, the thank you letters I received from him always began with, "Dear Miss Meri Mitsuyoshi," was a legacy of these lessons. At Topaz, my grandfather participated in Chiyoda Obata's art classes. It was while studying with Professor Obata that he painted the scene that later hung in a bedroom of his family's post-war home. In 1945, my grandparents returned to California. My grandfather found work as a caretaker on a family's country estate in Woodside. The Tamoras lived on the grounds, except for my mother, who worked as a domestic in the owner's primary home in San Francisco while attending secretarial school. After graduating, my mother began working at the VA in Menlo Park. Her salary helped make it possible for my grandparents to build their home and reestablish the flower nursery in East Palo Alto. My grandfather died in 1998. A year later, my grandmother, who passed away in 2000, moved with my aunt and uncle to Palo Alto. The painting now hangs in a central gathering area of my aunt's house. What was once hidden is now in open view.
Thank you so much. And now you can understand why I like to close exhibits with that story. We have time for questions from the audience. I'll start it off by asking Kaz, when did you start asking those questions? Then also, what made you start asking those questions?
Well, yeah, I never questioned my mother or father about anything about camp. Yeah, so I never did. But I think, like I said at the beginning, that I started questioning quite late, like in my writing class. I think that came into fruition. I think I probably thought about questioning them before, but they were gone by then. You know, so a lot of these questions are still unanswered about their actual feelings.
I wanted to ask you, and also any of your other family members who are here, who knew Harue, you know, the impression I got from her writing was that she always spoke her mind. She didn't hold back. So I'm wondering what she told you about her experiences during World War as you were growing up.
My mother was not hesitant in talking about every single detail of her incarceration. And so I'm sure my friend Joyce can tell you how outspoken she was, as well as family members if they want to speak. She had details from what she did when she got the notification, because she was a translator for INS. She was a federal employee. She was very proud of that. And she was advancing in her field. So she was shocked that the federal government would not protect her or her kin or her family. Do you remember? Joyce will tell you she was very clear about answering questions about her experience to anybody who asked her.
Moto. I'm the Harue's oldest son. My sister's oldest daughter. My mother was a very feisty person. And you folks actually heard a very polite version of Resettlement. And what you've read is very a polite version when she was being interviewed. How do I put this? She was known by people in the Nisei community as a very straightforward, straight shooter. She was very resilient because she would tell me stories about when we resettled. we had to go live somewhere else because the house was being occupied by these railway trash Okies that were living there that were very unsanitary. Uh, the house, they refused to vacate the house. My mother gave them the notification. And what happened was my grandfather somehow owned that piece of property and put in the care of a lawyer. And what happened was the lawyer passed away while we were in camp, and his son was supposed to take care of collecting the rent. And the son didn't know anything about it when my mother contacted him about rent, et cetera, et cetera. And then what happened was she confronted that individual, and this person happened to, if you don't know Oakland geographically, we live like 6 blocks from what they call the Oakland estuary. And the Oakland estuary at the time did very salvage work, repair work for things for the U.S. government. So this guy was a government worker. And of course, just being from camp, she asked him to quietly move out. And he said, well, you're a dirty Jap. I don't have to do this. Do you know who I work for? And my mother says, I don't give a GD who you work for. You know what I'm saying? You're in my house. And he said, you know, you're saying something against the government. And he said, I don't care because of the way the government treated us. So what he did, he literally called the FBI on my mother, saying that she was saying things that were unpatriotic toward this country. Right? This is what she told me anyway. And then so the FBI person got a hold of my mother, and they met together down there. And then my mother told her side of the story to the FBI agent. The FBI agent took sympathy on her and asked my mother, would she like to press charges against this individual? Because he would have him kicked out of the house. And hearing that, of course, the guy said, or I'll move out. Even though she took time to get, that's just one of the stories of, and since we're just talking about resettlement here, our house that you saw in the picture over there is on 6th and Madison Street. And what it is, it's on the corner. If you go down 6th Street, in a northerly direction, there's a Buddhist church of Oakland. Okay. Now, the Buddhist Church of Oakland on the settlement was running like a hostel over there. And then when we got full up, they would send them down to our house, my grandfather's house on 6th and Madison Street. And then, of course, that's got full up, and they couldn't take any more people. And it's like, like you heard my sister saying the story that she got fed up with got fed up with these people who didn't really want to go out there because they had it really easy. And because they would she would say smoke and play hana and drink. And hana, by the way, is a Japanese card game of which you can gamble at. And so she got disgusted with them, and like she said, she yelled at them and to get a job, and they got embarrassed and kind of moved out. One of the other things that I want to say on the resilience side, when we were walking, she had to walk us from West Oakland to 6th Street in order to clean the house up because it was unoccupied. She happened to pass by this in Oakland. There's a place called Housewives Market. She just coincidentally happened to be there on a Thursday, right? Taking us to the house. And she happened to stop by a fish market. And she was watching this guy because during those days on Friday, because most people were Christians and Catholics, they would eat fish on Friday. So this guy was cleaning the salmon up, right? And then the way they do fillets, they leave the head behind, the tail behind. Now they don't do that because of exposure of, the fish and stuff. And so she actually had the nerve to ask the guy, so what are you going to do with that fish head and tail and belly? He said, oh, we're going to throw it away. She said, don't throw it away. give it to me. I'll take it. But she had to swallow her pride in doing that. But the guy was so impressed with my mother that he said, if you come by anytime on a Thursday, come see me. I will save you the fish heads. So that's how she was also able to, support us during the resettlement period. I could tell you a whole bunch of other stories, but that's enough time. That's enough time for you folks.
Thank you very much for sharing those. Maybe we'll take you up on your offer to share them some other time. I was wondering, this is not included in your story at all, but you mentioned that your eldest brother, Satoshi, repatriated to Japan and remained there for the rest of his life. I was just wondering if you stayed in touch with him and what that was like, you know. I wanted to ask if anyone in the audience has a resettlement story that they would like to share, something from their family.
I remember all the things we used to do, especially going to the movies and, doing things at the temple. And I was aware when I was in high school that you were older because you're 3 years older than me, but you were 1 grade ahead of me in class with Ritzko and Florence, right? So, and Ritzko's regular, she's 1 year older, but Florence was 2 years older also because of Tule Lake. And then I realized that you were, 3 years older. So, but it's funny because I just never thought of the age difference when we were doing things together. But anyway, it's a long time. I saw you in San Mateo when your documentary it was at Kevin. Yeah. But that was good. I was interesting that, and I was glad he did something like that. And it was shown. Yeah. Yeah. So, I hope that you're going to be good and that it's not that serious, and I'll get in touch with you. I don't think I have your phone number anymore from 20 years ago or something, but I have your address. And we still do the Christmas card thing, so maybe I'll send a real early Christmas card and ask how you are.
So a few announcements. The Berkeley Historical Society is currently mounting an exhibit, Roots, Removal, and Resistance, Japanese Americans in Berkeley, at their center on Center Street, downtown Berkeley, through April 12th. And we will probably be collaborating with them in some way, either by linking some of our stories to the addresses on their digital map that shows where all of the Japanese American families were living. I went through our collection and found at least 11 stories that were linked to families on the map. There also might be a program in the spring sometime. And also for next year, we are planning to have an exhibit, probably a little different from this one, at the Japanese American Museum in San Jose. And that one will be from July 25th to November 9th. So we can bring your stories down the peninsula.
Just add something little, I'll hold this there. Both my parents were incarcerated at Topaz and came from San Francisco. So the interesting thing about today's presentation is that both of them, both the J-Sei side, my mother's side, had a dry cleaning business on Grant Avenue in North Beach. And my father's family were on Bush Street in Japantown. And they both had homes that they owned before the war and were able to come back to their homes after the war. And I think I didn't fully appreciate how lucky we were because there's so many that obviously didn't have that opportunity and a place to come back to. And it made a huge difference, I think, in, the rest of your life and how much struggle you have. So appreciate your stories that you shared with us today.